F1 2025, directed by Joseph Kosinski, accelerates into the heart of Formula One racing, with a high-octane blend of visceral action and emotional stakes, starring Brad Pitt as Sonny Hayes, a former prodigy returning to the sport after a career-ending crash. The film follows his quest to save the struggling APXGP team alongside rookie driver Joshua Pierce Damson Idris, fueled by stunning cinematography, a pulsating Hans Zimmer score, and real Grand Prix footage. F1 balances Hollywood spectacle with the raw intensity of motorsport. This recap will dissect the film's narrative, character dynamics, and technical triumphs that make it a thrilling, if flawed, tribute to the sport. Welcome back to Screen Sizzle. We extend our heartfelt thanks to you, our dedicated viewers, for joining us on our journey toward 1 million subscribers. Let me know which movie you want me to explain the meaning of by commenting below. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell to stay updated on our latest videos. All right, let's not keep you waiting any longer. Let's get started. The main character of the film is Sonny, played by Hollywood star Brad Pitt, a veteran racer who has competed on all the major tracks but is now retired to live a quiet life. The film opens with the 24 hours of Daytona race underway. With 4 hours to go, Sonny is called out to the track to replace his exhausted teammate. At this point, Sonny's team is ranked 7th with no chance of winning. But Sonny is not one to give up. He gets in the car, grips the steering wheel tightly, and suddenly accelerates to full speed. His close turn along the edge of the grass makes everyone hold their breath. The commentator exclaims, "It looks like Sonny left the brake pedal at home." The drama peaked in the final lap with only one obstacle left. Sonny unexpectedly gave way, causing his opponent to lose control and crash into the grass. And so, Sonny crossed the finish line to the cheers of everyone. Though he won the championship, Sonny didn't even touch the trophy. All he cared about was the check worth $5,000 USD. For Sonny, fame doesn't matter. What he wants is to continue conquering new racetracks and new challenges. Sonny is now at the laundry shop. Suddenly, an old friend appears, Ruben. But this time, Ruben came not just to reminisce about the past, but to ask for help. Ruben was drowning in a huge debt of nearly $3.5 million. His F1 team, APX, hadn't scored a single point after 2 seasons. The best driver had left, sarcastically saying that Apex's car was nothing more than a pile of scrap metal. The second driver is just a rookie. Though exceptionally talented, he is still too young and arrogant. There are only 9 races left. If the situation cannot be turned around, the sponsors will pull out and Ruben's Apex team risks having to disband. Ruben knew the only person with the guts to save that sinking ship was none other than Sonny. He dragged Sonny from the laundry shop to the bar. Despite his persuasive words, Sonny still shook his head. Because of the F1 racing accident 30 years ago, every time he sat in an F1 race car, Sonny was haunted by it. Ruben left in disappointment. However, before leaving, Ruben left a business-class ticket to London, where the next race would take place. Sonny sat alone at the bar. Looking at an old photo of himself, Sonny sat alone at the bar. Looking at an old photo of himself at his peak published in a magazine, hesitating over what choice to make. In London, Joshua, the young and arrogant driver of the Apex team, was testing a newly upgraded car model. But despite giving it their all, they were still 0.6 seconds short. He got angry and blamed the technical team for mistakes that caused the car to understeer in slow corners and oversteer in fast corners. With a car like that, how could they possibly win? The atmosphere in the Apex team was very tense, just as everyone was struggling to find a solution for the upcoming race. Sonny approached from afar. Ruben was delighted. He introduced Sonny to the entire team. First was Kate, the chief engineer responsible for car design, Kaspar, the head coach, and Joshua, the team's main driver. When Joshua saw Sonny, he gave him a disdainful look. A man past his prime, decades older than him. What could he possibly do? Joshua taunted. When was the last time you won? Sonny didn't bother arguing with words, but showed it through action. Sonny only asked to test drive the car Joshua had just driven earlier. If the result wasn't at least 1 second faster than Joshua's, he would leave immediately. The whole team was skeptical. The technicians even bet that Sonny would lose in the first few laps. Sonny couldn't control the speed because he wasn't used to the car's settings. But as time went on, Sonny broke away. On the final straight, Sony accelerated to the max, but the car malfunctioned and swerved into the barrier. After removing his helmet, Sony pointed out every technical flaw in the car, down to the smallest detail, exactly as Joshua had just complained about earlier. Everyone thought he had lost. But the final result appeared. Sony was 0.05 seconds faster than Joshua. Sony was officially accepted into the team before the stunned eyes of everyone. Although he had been so arrogant towards Sony earlier, Joshua was actually under a lot of pressure because he hadn't earned any points for the team. He was worried that his position would be replaced by Sony. The manager advised Joshua to take the initiative with the media to attract sponsors. Joshua went to see his mother to confide in her and ask for advice. Joshua's mother gently reminded him of what his father had once told him to focus solely on driving. A simple reminder, but it reignited Joshua's passion. Today was the press conference introducing Sony as the team's new driver for Apex. The event drew a large media crowd, but instead of welcoming him, they all mocked him. They said Sony was like an old man who hadn't set foot on an F1 track in over 30 years. What could he possibly do to turn the situation around? Even Joshua didn't defend his teammate, but instead mocked Sony. The climax came when a reporter brought up Sony's failed marriage to mock him, but he remained calm and simply replied, "Yes," without getting angry. The night before the first race, Sony couldn't sleep. He finished exercising and took out his books to review his knowledge like a new driver. The next morning, Sony also arrived early to go for a run to prepare. Joshua's mother urged him to apologize to Sony for his attitude at the press conference, but Joshua believed apologizing was a sign of weakness. However, he eventually listened to his mother and went to apologize to Sony, but the apology carried no weight. As for Sony, he didn't even bother with it. Sony just wanted to race against Joshua on the track. Before the race, Ruben introduced Sony to Peter, one of Apex's gold sponsors. However, this guy only cared about money and didn't know or care about cars. Returning for the first time after many years away from the track, Sony couldn't help but feel anxious. Before he could get used to the car, he was surrounded by skeptical stares. While the other drivers ran off to warm up, Sony's car remained stationary. The coaching staff thought Sony's car had a problem, but it wasn't a malfunction, but a strategy. Sony started last, using the time to warm up the tires. The official race began, and thanks to the tires achieving ideal grip, Sony surged forward powerfully. The roar of the engines pierced the air, but that advantage quickly vanished upon reaching the pit stop area. A newly hired technician fumbled, causing the tire change to take as long as 9 seconds, 3 times longer than usual. Sony's team plummeted in the rankings when he returned to the track just as he cut across Joshua's path. Logically, Sony should have yielded to his teammate, but he didn't. He forced his lane, blocking Joshua's overtaking path. The two fought for every inch like rivals until their cars collided and both crashed into the grass. Both had to abandon the race empty-handed that day. Joshua stormed into the room, yelling at the technician who made the mistake, then turned to blame his teammate. Kaspar tried to intervene, but Joshua continued to yell, calling Sony an arrogant jerk. The tension escalated, and just as the two were arguing, a group of reporters caught them. Seeing the cameras pointed at him, Joshua immediately flashed a fake, professional smile. Sony saw it and felt helpless. He growled sarcastically, "If you don't like how I race, then beat me instead of making me give in, you arrogant jerk." Right from their first collaboration, the two clashed like water and fire, even though they had only raced one stage. Sony quickly realized the problem with the Apex team. From the support staff to the commander and driver, they were all inexperienced, especially since the car couldn't beat strong rivals like Red Bull, Ferrari, or Mercedes. Unwilling to accept defeat, Sony proactively approached Chief Engineer Kate to request an upgrade for the car. Sony pointed out that with the current engine, they couldn't compete on straightaways, so if they wanted to win, they had to find a way to gain an advantage in the corners. But Kate immediately refused because after the lackluster performance in the previous race, she still didn't have enough confidence to bet on Sony. Nevertheless, Kate still gave Sony a chance, on the condition that Sony could complete an entire race without making any mistakes. She would upgrade the car exactly as he wanted. Sony and Joshua began preparing for the next race. While Joshua trained using physical exercises and modern analytical technology, Sony opted for the traditional approach of running to build stamina and practicing reflexes with a tennis ball. That night, Joshua went online to look up information about his new teammate. It turned out that Sony was once a promising name in F1 racing, even considered capable of surpassing the legendary Senna if he hadn't been involved in a horrific accident while trying to overtake Senna on a dangerous corner. The car flew off the track, Sony was thrown into the air, suffered severe injuries, and was never seen on the F1 circuit again before the start of the next race in Hungary. The entire team met to discuss their strategy in detail, but right from the first lap, the two Apex cars were stuck in the middle of the pack, blocked from overtaking. It seemed like all hope of scoring points was lost, but unexpectedly, Sony requested a change in strategy, switching to soft tires to increase speed. The technical team immediately objected because the weather in Hungary was too hot, and soft tires would wear out quickly, making it difficult to last 10 laps. Under the head coach's orders, the technical team still fitted Sonny with hard tires. However, he stubbornly refused to let the car start unless it was fitted with the correct type of tires he wanted. Under time pressure, the coach had no choice but to concede. They switched to soft tires for Sony. Immediately after the tire change, Sony sped out and intentionally turned the steering wheel, damaging the front wing of the opponent's car. A chaotic brawl erupted, forcing the safety car to enter and clear the track. The speed of all drivers was immediately slowed down. At this point, the entire Apex team finally understood Sony's plan, intentionally causing a collision to make the safety car appear and slow down the drivers. From there, Joshua's side could accelerate and break away without risking a speed battle. A bold, yet extremely clever move. Sony then repeated the same tactic. The minor collisions were just enough to cause disruption, forcing the safety car to continuously appear on the track. Each time this happened, the speed of the entire pack slowed down. Joshua quietly climbed the ranks. Sony even blocked his opponents to buy time. When the green flag was waved to signal yielding, Sony stubbornly dragged it out until the final warning before finally moving aside, although Sony finished last. Thanks to this tactic, Joshua crossed the finish line in 10th place. For the first time since Ruben took over, the team earned points, and Ruben could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Of course, after this disruption, Sony received a penalty, but his current meager salary wasn't enough to pay it. After the race, the press called Sony the man who turned F1 racing into bumper cars. Sony just sneered and said, "I'm just not used to the new car yet." A reporter sarcastically asked, "You were banned from casinos. Now you want to be banned from F1 too?" Sony didn't care and confidently challenged the reporter to bet with him. "My $10,000 against the reporter's £10 if Sony wins the next race at Monza. It'll prove his mettle." Kate then kept her word, beginning to research and upgrade the car according to Sony, from aerodynamic design, engine, transmission, braking system to the smallest details. And the result was surprising. Each lap was half a second faster. Not only Kate, but Joshua also began to see Sony in a different light. At the next race in Monza, the atmosphere within the Apex team was much more positive. The whole team sat down to discuss strategy as usual, but this time, the goal was no longer to make it into the top 10, but to take the number 1 position. Sony bluntly stated that after the race in Hungary, he would definitely be noticed and closely followed by the other teams. Therefore, this time, he would proactively hold back the strong drivers, creating space for Joshua to be less noticed and break away. And indeed, Sony was very smart and experienced. Sony deliberately drove until his tires were worn out, causing debris to scatter all over the track. The organizers were forced to bring in the safety car earlier than planned. The speed of all cars on the track was reduced to 40%, meaning the entire racing strategy had to be re-established from scratch. While the teams were still scrambling to recalculate, Joshua took the opportunity to accelerate and climb the ranks. A short while later, it started to rain. The road surface was very slippery, forcing many drivers to pit to change to intermediate tires to ensure safety. The finish line was only a few laps away, and Joshua was holding 4th place. The coaches quickly analyzed that the 2 drivers in 2nd and 3rd place were likely to make pit stops, while the leading driver might take a risk and push to the finish. Just as predicted, both cars pulled into the pit stop. Joshua immediately accelerated to take 2nd place. Sony also read the situation and proactively drove ahead to create a slipstream effect, helping Joshua accelerate on the straight section. Joshua stayed close behind his rival, waiting for an opportunity to overtake, and then the corner that Sony had mentioned during practice appeared. This seemed like an opportunity for Joshua to turn the tables and move into first place. But suddenly, Sony realized something was wrong. The rain had made the road surface at that corner much slipperier than during practice, something not accounted for in the initial calculations. He shouted into the radio, trying to stop Joshua from overtaking. But it was too late. Joshua's car plowed into the curve at high speed, skidded off the road, flew into the air, spun around, and crashed back down to the ground with a terrifying impact. A loud explosion echoed as the car ignited, turning into a fiery red ball of flame. Sony immediately slammed on the brakes and leaped out of the car like a gust of wind. He disregarded the danger, running across the track through the flames to save his teammate. At that moment, the rescue team also arrived just in time, thanks to Sony's unhesitating efforts. Joshua was pulled out of the burning car, seeing his teammate limp lifelessly in his arms. Sony choked back tears, blaming himself as if he had committed an unforgivable sin. Fortunately, Joshua only suffered burns to his hand, not life-threatening, but he was forced to temporarily withdraw from competition for a period. Meanwhile, Sony continued to torment himself. When Joshua's mother stormed in to scold him, saying that he and Joshua were teammates and that he should have protected her son, Sony stood silently like a statue, quietly enduring Joshua's mother's wrath without a word of protest, even though Sony had warned Joshua not to overtake. But he recklessly charged ahead. That evening, at the press conference, Sony became the focus of criticism. The media and even Sony himself believed he was responsible for Joshua's accident. This time, Ruben didn't stay silent. He stepped forward to share the pressure with his friend. While Joshua was undergoing treatment, a reserve driver named Luca was brought in to replace him. Due to the incident in the previous stage, the Apex team was placed last on the starting grid for the Dutch race by the organizers on the grounds of unfair play. But Sony didn't let that dampen his spirits. He said, "If we can be just 1 second faster per lap, victory is still possible." Sony's optimism spread like an electric current through the team, giving them the strength to push forward. Despite starting last, the Apex team still finished in 9th place. From then on, the relationship between Kate and Sony began to blossom, while Joshua continued to train quietly every day, waiting for the day he could return, riding the wave of victory. Sony led the Apex team step by step up the rankings. In Japan, the team rose to 7th place. By the time they reached Mexico, they continued to climb to 5th place. The way Sony controlled the car made both experts and audiences take their hats off. But as Sony's name was increasingly hyped by the press, Joshua's glory gradually faded. Even Joshua's manager began to have doubts whether Sony was intentionally stifling Joshua's career. The next race took place in Belgium. By this point, Sony had fully integrated into the team, no longer keeping his distance as before. Joshua had also recovered and was ready to return after the accident. However, upon his first return to the track after the incident, Joshua felt that nothing was the same as before. The speed, the pressure, the stares from the stands, all of it made him feel confused. He began to doubt his former teammate, wondering if Sony was still trustworthy. When the race began, the two still worked together quite well. They charged into the turns, closing in on other riders to gradually overtake them. But at a dangerous curve, Joshua suddenly broke away from Sony's slipstream. A sudden swerve caused the two cars to rub against each other for a split second. Then Sony's car was thrown off the track. The whole team was stunned. No one could understand what Joshua was doing. On his first day back after the accident, he had already thrown everyone into chaos. Although Joshua finished with a decent ranking, for Sony, it no longer mattered. He was furious, venting his frustration directly at Joshua. If he wanted to ruin his career, go ahead. I've seen hundreds of kids as talented as you come and go. No one remembers their names. Sony understood Joshua was doing this because he hated him. But he didn't care, because this wasn't just between the two of them, but affected the whole team. The people who had worked hard every day to give Joshua the chance to return to the track, standing nearby. Kate heard every word Sony said and had to admit that Sony spoke for everyone else on the Apex team. After the race, when asked by reporters about the collision, Joshua just shrugged it off as if it weren't a big deal. There were only 2 races left in the season. Tomorrow the race is in Las Vegas, yet the atmosphere within the Apex team is very tense. Seeing the internal discord like this, if nothing is done, the team will lose their jobs. Kate decided to take Sony and Joshua to a bar to reconcile. She hoped a pleasant conversation would ease the tension. But after sitting down for just a few minutes, Sony and Joshua began to exchange sarcastic remarks, forcing Kate to speak up. She was the one who had poured her heart and soul into creating the car for both of them. She believed she deserved to see them resolve their conflict in a more civilized manner. She suggested playing a game of poker, with the winner becoming the main driver tomorrow, and if Kate won, she would be the one to decide. All 3 nodded and began playing, while betting. For the first time, the 2 main drivers of Apex had the chance to sit and talk for so long. Sony bluntly pointed out Joshua's flaws, lack of skill and courage. Joshua countered that Sony was just an old man living in the glory of the past, constantly imposing his outdated ideas on others. But when Kate suddenly asked both of them how old they were when their fathers died, they both answered in unison 13. It felt like touching a deep, hidden sympathy. The conversation suddenly softened. Kate asked why they chose racing, and Joshua answered without hesitation for money, for fame, for free clothes. As he spoke, he tapped his phone to reply to comments from fans. Sony quietly replied, "All that stuff is trivial. Just focus on driving, you'll be great." Those words made Joshua pause, like a counterattack. Joshua pushed all his chips into the bet, and Sony and Kate also went all in. When the cards were revealed, Joshua won with 2 5s, meaning he would drive the main race tomorrow. After that, the manager called Joshua over to the next table to meet the sponsor, leaving Kate and Sony sitting together. Sony looked at Kate with eyes that were both longing and full of affection. But Kate emphasized that she was only attracted to victory, while Sony had just lost the hand. Then Sony turned over his cards 2 kings. It turned out he had intentionally let Joshua win. Faced with such a deep man, Kate decided to break the rules she herself had set not to date anyone on the team and rewarded Sony with a sweet, fiery night. On the other side, Joshua waited until nearly 1 a.m., but still saw no sign of any sponsors showing up. When a girl finally approached to talk, Joshua was thrilled to be noticed, only to find out she had mistaken him for a racer from another team. The embarrassment killed his mood, so he waved a light goodbye and left in silence. At the same time, Sonny suddenly woke from a nightmare. He stepped out onto the balcony to breathe in some fresh air, and Kate quietly followed behind him. It turned out that the nightmare had been haunting him all these years. The accident had taken away the greatest opportunity of his life. He was just a few turns away from overtaking Cena to become the youngest world champion in history. But it all collapsed in an instant. All that remained was a furious Sony, empty and unsure of who he was anymore. For him, everything in life could be lost. But the cockpit was the only place where he felt truly alive, free, soaring, and at peace. As the 2 were talking, Ruben suddenly burst in with a tense expression, bringing shocking news. Their car had been confiscated by the FIA organizers. An anonymous person had sent an email accusing APX of using an illegally upgraded chassis, violating technical regulations. The problem was that the chassis design was top-secret documentation, only accessible to the Apex team. This meant the accuser must have come from within the racing team itself. The organizing committee demanded that if Apex wished to continue participating, they must replace all previously approved components. This meant they would have to race with an outdated car that was nearly incapable of competing at the current time. Ruben was so angry he couldn't speak. He thought this was clearly commercial espionage, but the organizers weren't here to listen to negotiations. They were here to make an announcement. The atmosphere in the racing team was very tense. The good run had just sparked a glimmer of hope, but now it had plummeted to a suffocating low. Sony tried to stay calm, but he understood better than anyone else. The old version of the car was like crap. Kate's eyes were filled with worry as she watched Sony enter the racetrack, carrying anger that hadn't yet subsided. Perhaps that's why he chose the wrong driving mode, causing the battery to drain too quickly. The coaching staff tried to remind him to adjust it, but Sony ignored them. Emotions completely overwhelmed reason at that moment. He pressed the accelerator to the floor, sending the car hurtling like a flash, reaching a speed of nearly 340 km/h, almost the maximum. Sony was in second place. Then came a turn, and he maintained the same speed to overtake his opponent. But the sharp turn caused the car to lose balance. It skidded along the guardrail and flew straight off the track. The entire Apex team held their breath. It seemed like this racing team was plagued by constant bad luck. First Joshua, now Sony had an accident. Fortunately, Sony only suffered minor injuries. However, this accident not only jolted the entire team awake, but also left Ruben speechless. He realized Sony's old injury had flared up again. The accident 30 years ago had caused Sony's vision to deteriorate and his spine to suffer severe damage. And all this time, Sony had secretly hidden his medical records from Ruben. Angry and hurt, Ruben silently blamed himself, thinking that if he had known his friend was like this, he would never have dragged Sony back on the track. Ruben made a very difficult decision to remove Sony from the team to save his life. When he looked at Ruben with heavy eyes, Sony understood clearly that his old friend was struggling under the pressure from investors and the expectations of the entire team. But he also understood himself better than anyone else. Racing was his reason for living, the only thing he wanted to do until the end of his life. Even so, Ruben remained adamant about his decision. At the same time, Joshua decided to face his obsession, the curve that had caused his accident in Italy. Joshua practiced again and again in the simulator cockpit, persisting from morning to night to find a way to overcome the turn that had caused his failure. After many attempts, Joshua finally succeeded. When Sony was discharged from the hospital, the whole team flew to Abu Dhabi to prepare for the final race. Surprisingly, Peter, the investor who appeared at the beginning of the film, came to meet him. It turned out that from the start, the board of directors had planned to sell the APX team. The board agreed to let him join APX to race so the team would finish last and be dissolved, but the outcome was the opposite of what they expected. Since Sony joined APX, everything changed completely, causing a long line of investors waiting to buy. Peter, behind the scenes of the deal, made Sony a lucrative offer just make the APX team lose in the final stage, and Ruben would be replaced, with Sony becoming captain next season. Not only did Sony gain power, but he also received a huge cut from the deal and became wealthy. But it was at this very moment that Peter revealed his true colors. He was the one who had forged the car upgrade documents. Sony just sneered, realizing that from start to finish, it was all just a power game among the capitalist elite. As for Ruben, he and everyone else on the team were just pawns on that chessboard. Tomorrow is the final race. Joshua couldn't hide his worries. He confessed to his mother that, at the race in Italy, he was the one who decided to rush into the race even though Sony had told him to wait. The feeling of regret that had weighed heavily on him all this time was finally spoken. Joshua was tormented because he had blamed Sony for everything. When the manager walked in to announce the schedule for the exchange with the sponsor, which would bring a series of privileges such as plane tickets and cars, Joshua simply shook his head in refusal, saying he only wanted to focus all his energy on tomorrow's race. Without Sony, the entire team felt like they'd lost their spirit. A gloomy atmosphere hung heavy, forcing Joshua to actively gather each technician to go for a run, regaining their momentum before the final stretch. Ruben walked in, meeting Joshua's determined gaze, and smiled softly upon seeing the once arrogant young man had truly matured. As the team was running, a familiar figure suddenly appeared. Sony was back. He brought a stack of papers from the lawyer, confirming that Ruben would not bear any legal responsibility related to his health condition, while also subtly reminding Ruben that he still owed him 1 month's final salary. Ruben hesitated, fearing Sony wasn't fit enough to race because this race was truly too risky. But Sony was adamant. If his fate was to live or die behind the wheel, that was a choice he had made long ago. He didn't need anything grand, just to fight one last time with everything he had left, under the hopeful gaze of the entire team. Ruben finally nodded. Everyone understood this might be the last time Sony would appear on the F1 track. At the same time, the organizers discovered that the component report that had caused the Apex team's car to be banned from upgrades was fake. The car was upgraded again. In another development, Peter was selling the APX team to investors. Suddenly, he saw Sony appear. Immediately after, Peter's phone vibrated with a message from Sony. It was the middle finger emoji, a cold rejection, a silent slap in the face for the traitor. The final race took place in Abu Dhabi with a total of 58 laps. The strategy was to keep the tires durable for as long as possible. However, right from the first lap, Sony was locked in a collision with an opponent's car, forcing him to make an early pit stop than planned. By lap 25, Joshua had accelerated to 6th place, while Sony was in 22nd position. On a straight section, Sony activated DRS to accelerate up to 15th place. The two worked in perfect sync, maintaining their strategy and a steady race pace. By lap 38, Joshua had taken the lead, but right behind him were two rivals who had just changed tires, meaning they would quickly catch up. With only 4 laps remaining, Sony was in 4th place, while Joshua began to drop to 2nd place due to his tires being too worn. Team Apex had almost no chance to improve their position. Changing tires would cost them the lead, but not changing them meant they couldn't last until the end of the race. It was a very difficult situation to make the right decision. And then, an unexpected incident occurred. Unclear whether it was random or part of Sony's plan. His car was hit hard in the rear by an opponent and crashed into the barrier. The collision sent debris flying across the track. The referee was forced to wave the red flag to temporarily halt the entire race to repair the barrier. But in this misfortune, luck emerged because yesterday, Team Apex finished last in the qualifying round, so now they became the only team eligible for new tires, an advantage worth its weight in gold. With these perfect tires, the opportunity to accelerate past their rivals finally arrived for Team Apex. Head coach Kaspar personally changed the tires on Sony's car. The entire team held their breath in anticipation of the final sprint laps where everything could change. When all the red lights simultaneously turned off, Sony and Joshua shot out of the starting line like two arrows tearing through the wind. They coordinated smoothly, gliding past a series of opponents to climb to 2nd and 3rd place, closely trailing the leading driver, Hamilton. A moment later, Joshua surged ahead to take the lead. But Hamilton wasn't a novice. He deliberately swerved to cause a collision, sending Sony's car spinning several times on the track. Despite this, Sony quickly regained control and continued the race without hesitation. With just 1 lap remaining, Joshua and Hamilton engaged in a tense chase, battling each other inch by inch for the finish line. Then fate struck, and both cars collided, flying off the track in an instant. It seemed as if Apex had lost everything, but suddenly, Sony appeared like a miracle. He returned to the track at lightning speed, surging into the lead in the blink of an eye. The corners that seemed dangerous now glided smoothly under his wheels. Sony flew by, his entire body synchronized with each throttle, each turn of the steering wheel. Nothing could stop him. And when the checkered flag waved amid the frenzied cheers, Sony crossed the finish line first, bringing a historic victory to the Apex team. The entire grandstand erupted with shouts, applause, and tight hugs, tears rolling down the cheeks of the team members. This victory was not just a title, it was the result of sweat. This victory was not just a title, it was the result of sweat, tears, and trust in their teammates. A racing team that had been ranked last and was once a laughingstock in the eyes of the media has now rewritten history not by ranking but by their steel spirit and unbreakable bond. Ruben, once a team captain under pressure, now walks tall to receive the spotlight. As for Peter, the one who once pulled the strings behind the scenes, he is now just a faded name left behind amid the thunderous applause. When the champagne cork popped, white foam sprayed amid cheers that we were the best in the world. But while everyone was still celebrating, Sonny quietly left the crowd and found a quiet corner. Kate walked over and gave him a kiss as a well-deserved reward for a hero. Then Sony took his luggage and left. Joshua ran after him and asked where he was going. Sony just smiled and replied simply, "Off to conquer new goals. See you later, you arrogant jerk." A few days later, Sony drove through a desert in Mexico to register for an off-road race there. When they heard the name Sony Hayes, everyone there said they had no money to pay. But Sony calmly replied, "What does money matter for me? Living fully with my passion for speed is the most important thing." The film ends with an open ending, signaling that Sony's journey is not over yet. Ahead lie new races that are more challenging, yet also full of promise. F1 the movie delivers a complete cinematic experience, both visually stunning and profound. The film builds the image of the main character as a veteran driver who had fallen into obscurity, now returning to the track to revive a rookie racing team while also finding himself. The contrast and evolution in the relationship throughout the film makes the story more human than just revolving around speed. In terms of special effects, the film scores with realistic racing scenes, authentic engine sounds, and a near-perfect recreation of the sensation of speed. Close-up shots in the cockpit paired with tense background music create heart-pounding climaxes. I recommend you watch the film to fully experience the special effects and sound design. F1 2025 crosses the finish line as a bold, crowd-pleasing addition to the sports drama genre, delivering breathtaking race sequences and a compelling, if predictable, redemption arc. While its narrative leans heavily on familiar underdog tropes and sacrifices, some Formula One authenticity for dramatic flair, Joseph Kosinski's technical mastery, and Brad Pitt's charismatic performance elevate the film into a visceral cinematic ride. The emotional interplay between Sonny Hayes and Joshua Pierce, coupled with the film's nod to real-world F1 culture, ensures its appeal to both casual viewers and racing enthusiasts. F1 not only celebrates the sport's adrenaline, but also sets a new benchmark for racing films, leaving audiences eager for more. Thanks for watching our video. We are Screen Sizzle. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell to catch our latest uploads. We're grateful for your support on our journey to 1 million subscribers. Let me know which movie you want me to explain the meaning of by commenting below. Until next time, enjoy the movie.